Now, on this day in 1900, Queen Victoria signed the document to create the Commonwealth of Australia. Do we still have such an entity? I wonder what is the Commonwealth amongst us all. Well, today, September 17, Melbourne's lockdown will surpass the length of that which happened in Wuhan. The residents of Melbourne's north and western suburbs, can you believe this, have been locked up for 11 weeks in isolation. Think about it. Melbourne is the only place in the world with measures such as this. And as I will suggest in a moment, they're most probably all illegal. Just on this issue of illegality, it seems we're drowning in it. Professor David Flint, writing in The Spectator of September 19, magnificent magazine that, quotes Ronald Reagan when Reagan said, quote, "Freedom is a fragile thing, never more than one generation away from extinction." And Professor Flint highlights that this National Cabinet continues to downplay the recent revelation that the economic depression that governments have imposed on the nation could never be legally justified. The so-called secret modelling on which this absurd response has been based, shut everything down, was in error by a factor of between 80 and 415. Now, I've made these points before, a massive mistake. They won't admit to it. And Professor Flint says, and I quote his words, if anybody else made such a mistake with such consequences, we'd have to ask whether they would be expected to keep their job, if not in court. As I've said from day one, why didn't our so-called leaders exercise judgment instead of computer programming, which on previous occasions, particularly in relation to climate change, had been found to be completely flawed? Since the argument volunteered by the Prime Minister was that we were going to flatten the curve, that is, allow hospitals to cope, well, that occurred long ago. Today in Australia, we have, from coronavirus, 111 people in hospital, 16 in intensive care. The curve couldn't be flatter. Some of them are now trying eradication, which is a nonsense. No government can eradicate a virus. And not even with a vaccine can you do that. Think of the deaths every year from influenza, even when we have a vaccine. And then Professor David Flint, who has written extensively on the Australian Constitution, he is an emeritus professor of law, argues there is sound legal argument that governments cannot restrict the common law right to conduct a business. He also argues there is good reason to believe that the blanket overseas travel ban is unlawful. One of Melbourne's leading QCs, Michael Wiles, has questioned the validity of this extraordinary martial law curfew in Victoria. I keep saying, where is the evidence that justifies what we're being asked to suffer? Where is the evidence for the lockdown? Where is the evidence that says we must wear masks? Where is the evidence that's frightened people into believing they're all at risk? There is none. Why isn't the Constitution being defended? Why has Australia become victim of the unlawful behaviour of governments? Lies are being told everywhere. And now we have the story yesterday that Australia's top health official, then Professor Brendan Murphy, wrote to Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, offering the use of Australian Defence Force personnel at the height of the quarantine crisis. Andrews has denied that ever happened. I repeat, when you get a top Melbourne QC talking about a flaw in the legal basis for the curfew, where is the federal government challenging everything Andrews has done? A raft of international experts, including the World Health Organisation, say that border closures have no effectiveness. But the Queensland Premier says she doesn't decide. The Chief Medical Officer, the hopelessly unqualified Jeanette Young, she makes the decisions. Because Jeanette Young is the expert that suits the Premier. The curfew in Melbourne was not asked for by any expert. Not by the police, not by the Chief Health Officer, Sutton. As I keep saying, the Nobel Prize winner, Professor Michael Levitt, says lockdowns are a huge mistake. The Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at Oxford University, Sunetra Gupta, has urged, quote, urged Australia to abandon its selfish and self-congratulatory lockdown tactics. Why isn't this stuff adhered to by the Commonwealth Government? Why do we continue to make people suffer? Daniel Andrews is delivering a $23 billion hit to the CBD, and Melbourne's inner suburbs this year, wiping out 22,000 jobs. In the next 5 years, they say, the Victorian capital could lose up to $110 billion and 79,000 jobs on government impositions which may well be illegal. Is this bloke Andrews determined to kill Victoria rather than admit his mistakes? As Andrew Bolt says today, why then are Melbourne houses flying black banners with slogans like, "Thanks, Dan, we stand with you," or "This man is the #1 Premier, he should be PM," or "Chairman Dan, he's a bloody legend"? This is only because people have not been told the truth. And there has been unfair criticism also of the Morrison government getting away from Victoria, limiting the ability of Australians to return home. Many are blaming the federal government. There are nearly 20,000 Australians stranded overseas. The issue is not the Morrison government. There are plenty of empty seats on planes landing in Australia. The problem is detention centres to quarantine on arrival. So, back to the states. Again, states have a cap on the number of international arrivals per week who can go into quarantine. And as the federal government says, for example, Perth has 15,048 hotel beds available. The cap on quarantine in WA, 525. Sydney has 43,102 hotel beds available. The cap on international arrivals, 2,450. Commercial airlines are ready to bring people home, but the states say the quarantine system is close to the limit. How could the Perth quarantine system be close to the limit when there are 15,000 plus hotel beds available and only 525 international arrivals allowed? Again, the same old question. Who's going to pull the states into line?